So now we got to the green stage in spiral dynamics, which is a stage which started, or which had the first examples of it appearing about 100 years ago or so. We can see it in social democracy, communism, New Age and the hippies, but also the values of environmental action groups. And basically, again, as an earlier stage, this stage is the solution to a previous problem. Because in orange, people became so individualistic, so much consumption oriented, that they started depleting the resources of Mother Earth. And something needs to be done against that in order to guarantee the survival of the human species. And not only of human species, but also of other animal species. If we're looking at the state of the world, the state of nature, we're in a pretty bad situation. Now, what happens in this stage is that people start looking back at the purple era. Basically because purple is all about people living in harmony with Mother Nature. But people with these green values have some kind of idealized, some kind of romantic vision of this egalitarian and harmonious times. It's not that people were having such an easy life. It's not that they all lived in harmony. Not at all. But I think it's very important to look back at this stage, the purple stage of the hunter-gatherers, the nomads, the horticultural societies, because they cared very much about the well-being of the group. Harmony between people was very important. Equality was quite important. Now, what about marriage and sex in the green stage? Basically, green has some kind of repulsion against everything of the past. Marriage is bad. So they start experimenting with the abolition of marriage and setting up new structures. And for example, the Soviet Union was maybe the first big example of that. In the first 10 years of the existence of the Soviet Union, marriage was abolished, and basically there was, civil marriage was almost inexistent, and people were just living together, taking care of each other, and also the state took care of them if they could not take care of themselves. The state was the new social safety net. Also children, when a child was born, it did not belong to the mother and father in these experiments, but it became part of society. Now, after about 10 years, all these experiments in the Soviet Union basically collapsed because it was just unmanageable. There was not enough trust between the people. It was not rooted in a sense of consciousness of the need to live together, but it was more about a repulsion of the past. We see something similar in the hippie communities or now in the Bay Area, where people experiment with new types of relationship structures, where people decide maybe not to get married, but they may live together with some other people, with some friends with benefits, or they may set up some kind of polycule, or you have a huge and very, very rich vocabulary with like words like roping family and so on and so on. Now the problem with all of this is that people seek freedom, but they're not willing to have responsibility. And I want to be very clear here. The problem is not with the values of green. It's not that this abolition of marriage in se is something bad. No, it's not. It's just that humanity is not ready yet. We do not yet have this level of compassion and acceptance of others. We're still too much in an individualistic mindset where we think we own others. People are still a little bit too possessive. I mean, people want to have sexual freedom for themselves, but they do not necessarily want to grant it to their partner. Maybe the last thing that I want to say with regards to this marital systems and sex is that in this green stage, virginity has no value. It's not something that should be venerated. And there is also much more, and there's more an easygoingness about sexual non-monogamy. Still, it is very important that cheating is not allowed. Again, it's not about the sexual act, but it's more about breaking some kind of unspoken promise. It's about breaking the trust that has been built between two or even more partners in this case. So what about prostitution? Well, also here we see that people turn against the values of the previous era. So whereas in the past it were the prostitutes who were stigmatized and the clients were somehow okay, in this stage it's the people who turn to prostitutes who become stigmatized, and there is more of an understanding and compassion towards prostitutes. But still there are different views. For example, in Scandinavia there is this idea that in order to protect women from being exploited in prostitution, prostitution should just be forbidden. But there's other parts of the world where they look at it in a completely different way. They just think that many of these commercial sex workers actually make a conscious decision that this is what they want to do. Many of these people actually gain satisfaction from what they are doing. They like their job just like anybody else may like their job. So instead of forbidding the existence of prostitution, some people with these green values think that we should allow it, but we should just give rights to these people and we should really have a good system to protect them. So what about sexual orientation and gender identity? Well, basically in terms of sexual orientation, it's all about the free will of people. Whatever people want themselves is fine, as long as nobody's suffering, as long as nobody's being harmed in this process. And the same applies to gender identity. The way you feel is fine. If you are born a man but you feel a woman, that is fine. There is a huge tolerance for that. So this is how the LGBTQIA+ community became really accepted in the green society. It's also a huge understanding and acceptance for everybody who's non-binary, transgender, gender non-conforming, and so on. It's also where we see these pronouns of he, him, his, or she, her, her, or they, them, their. But it's very important to see that this gender identity really has nothing to do with sex. It's about identity. People somehow feel lost in the previous structures and they need to refine themselves. And as we're having this kind of sexual freedom, this is how they try to identify themselves. Identity is all about how do we relate to the group. And because of this sexual freedom, the sexual component has become very important of how we relate to the group. Now, sexual education in green becomes important again. Sex is seen as a normal and a natural part of life, and people should know something more about that. But there's maybe one little problem I would say about it, and this is that there is a lot of romantic views, because it's no longer about what science is right or what has proven to be right, but any view that a person holds is okay and is right and merits to be respected. And the problem is that in sexual education, it's instead of giving a true education about facts and true analysis, it's more about spreading all different types of views. Now let's look also at sex and spirituality, because in this green stage, people want to return to some kind of natural spirituality. There's some kind of admiration, some kind of idealization and romanticization of the spiritual attitude of the first human tribes, these hunter-gatherers and nomads and horticulturalist societies. Basically, these people really had a strong connection between sex and spirituality, and people in green want to go back to that. But there is one problem. People in our contemporary society are too disconnected from nature. So they are talking about something, but they actually don't really have a clue. They do not know how these people were really feeling 20, 30,000 years ago. And quite often people start talking about issues like sacred sexuality, about tantra or some kind of shamanic approach to sexuality. But these are some kind of reinventions. They're not rooted in a true connection to nature. So let's end this video by having a look at the sexual values and norms in green. It's clear that the main value is all about sexual freedom. People should have their free will, their agency to interact sexually the way that they want. But I see that there's quite some problems actually in green. First of all, this whole attack on the patriarchal values and fully endorsing matriarchal values has some negative consequences as well. Instead of going from one extreme to the other extreme, maybe it would be better to try to find some kind of balance between them. The second problem I see is this whole banalization of sex as a tool for socialization. It's as if having free sex with everybody is some kind of normal, natural thing and is going to really lead to a better society. Now, let's not glorify that much what was happening in purple. It was not that it was an easy stage, it was not that everybody was living in full harmony, because let's not forget that it actually created problems and the next stage was needed to actually curb this freedom. So let's not glorify all of the sexual freedom as the highest good, because the problem is that if freedom happens without responsibility, it can become pretty nasty. And I think the experiments of the Soviet Union or hippie communities have really shown that. And the final thing that I want to say is that it is very important that we accept people who are transgender or identify as non-binary, that we accept them in our community and that we allow them to be part of our society just like anybody else. But we need to ask ourselves the question, if we accept something, does that mean that it is natural? It's an open question. I know it is provocative, but again, after the green stage, where we are partially, or some of us are, there is going to be a new one, and it is going to be created on the basis of the problems of our society. And maybe these are some of these problems.